Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is part 2 of my conversation with Bethany Robbins about talking to your children about sex. In the previous episode, Bethany and I shared 2 stories about how our parents talk to us about sex. Today, we get very practical about what to say to your children and what gets in the way of creating an environment where your children can grow into a healthy sense of their own sexuality. Thank you so much for listening. Here's part 2 of my conversation with Bethany. All right, I want to transition now to away from these stories, though we may refer back to them, and into some real practical stuff. And Bethany and I are just going to do kind of back and forth on this. When you talk to your children about sex, here are the key points. At least you need to at least cover these key points. And there are 5 of them, and we'll just go back and forth. So I'll take the first one. You have to tell them what sex is. And you have to use correct terminology, accurate language. It's important to understand that oftentimes abusers will use inaccurate names for body parts, silly language, vulgar language. And this makes it very difficult for young children to report abuse because they don't know what the right language is. So when you talk to your kids about sex, number 1 is you have to tell them what it is, and you have to use correct terminology. And again, if you're uncomfortable with saying things like a man puts his penis in a woman's vagina, if you're uncomfortable saying that, you need to engage that discomfort. It's not your fault. It's part of your story. There's a reason you're uncomfortable with it. But why not engage that so that you can get to a place where you're regulated and comfortable using that language with your children, because they need to hear that language. All right, that's number 1. Number 2, Bethany.
Yeah, number 2, you have to tell them that sex feels good. It's not gross. It doesn't have to be painful. It can be immensely pleasurable. And that pleasure is meant for both people. Okay, so a lot of the popular books on sex, sexuality, especially written by Christians for adults of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, have very little language about female pleasure. Many of them lack that teaching, that language altogether lacking.
Right. And so I'm interrupting you, but sorry to interrupt you, but just to state something that's so obvious here. Here's the dilemma with that. In God's immense creativity, he actually created the clitoris, which is the only organ, it's the only body part that has no function other than sexual pleasure. And yet, in these books, go ahead, look in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the books that were published, the Christian books that are published about sex, I challenge you to find sentences that rejoice in or name or talk about female sexual pleasure. And yet, there's the clitoris, which is its sole purpose is sexual pleasure. So sorry, I interrupted you, but I had to add that.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and the clitoris actually has more nerve endings than a penis, right? So that's, it's clearly, sex is meant to be pleasurable for women. It's meant to be enjoyed together with someone who honors you and your sexuality, right? And so many of these books that our parents were reading when we were growing up, if you're Gen X or millennial, they're reading these books, and most of what it has to offer women is that sex is a duty that you owe your husband, right? Or a man. So, I mean, there are a lot of terrible messages being written about and given to people throughout the last few decades within the church community. So just to be aware of, even just thinking about reflecting on your own sex life as a parent, if sex has not been pleasurable for you, either for a man or a woman, if it's been traumatic or painful, those are stories of harm, stories that need to be grieved, right? And stories that need to be processed before you're even able to talk to your child about how sex can be pleasurable. There's no way you can have that discussion without knowing in your body first that sex can be a wonderful, pleasurable gift.
All right, that's number 2. Number 3, talking to your kids about sex needs to include language about pornography, because it's inevitable that your children will be exposed to pornography sooner or later, likely sooner. So, Bethany, you told me that there's a series of American studies that say the average age for pornography exposure is 9 to 10 years old, that it happens as early as 5. And again, here's what you're confronted with if you're going to talk about pornography with your children. What you're confronted with is, have you engaged your own feelings about pornography and perhaps its presence in your marriage or your private life? If you haven't, then those feelings will seep out when you're talking with your kids about porn, even if you quote unquote craft your words perfectly and say the perfect sentences. Your children need language around why pornography exists, and they need language around why their body might respond, not might, will respond to pornographic images that they see.
Yes, of course. Of course, our bodies are meant to respond to sexual images. That's the way God made us.
Yeah, say more about that. Even children, even pornography, Bethany?
Yes, I mean, we are built for beauty. We are made to connect deeply in relationship, and intrigue, mystery, arousal. All of those things are part of that. So it's not unusual. It's not crazy that even a child would be curious, especially around something they've never seen before. They've never talked about before. They have no language for. What is this new image? What am I being introduced to? So just simply the fact that they're seeing pornography for the first time and they've possibly not talked about it with their parents, the amount of mystery and curiosity that would come up for them is immense and so normal.
Yeah, and I'm calling to mind now a story of a woman who, the part I want to emphasize right now is that she was introduced to female pornography at a very young age, 4 or 5. And one of the things that she had such a hard time grappling with is that 5-year-old thought the woman in the centerfold was absolutely beautiful. Was just her felt bodily memory was, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. Like what you might sense or feel when you look at a piece of art that you just find remarkably beautiful. That's going to happen to children when they're exposed to pornography. They are going to see something that registers, at least in part, as beautiful, because intrigue and differentness is often beautiful and mysterious and arousing and intriguing. As a parent, if you are I'm not condoning pornography, but I'm saying that if you as a parent are disgusted by pornography, and especially by how pornography may have stolen from you in your marriage, in your romantic relationships, with your partners, I mean, we all have stories with it, either with us, with our spouse, both, but oftentimes those stories involve immense heartache and anguish and sometimes disgust. If you haven't processed through that, what's going to come out when you talk to your kids about pornography is immense contempt and immense disgust. That's going to be really hard for a child to process when their exposure to pornography is not it's not solely a disgusting experience for them. They may experience some disgust depending on the nature of it, how violent it is, etc. They may experience no disgust. They may experience just a sense of this is beautiful, but it will at least be intriguing. and that they will be very confused if your dialogue with them is, this is unequivocally bad and horrific. That's going to confuse them if their body doesn't have that same reaction. Did that make sense, Bethany? Is there anything you want to clarify about what I just said?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think just helping kids understand their bodies were made to recognize beauty, and that when you have something so new, and so interesting, so other, and yet somewhat familiar. I mean, they might see themselves in that. That's a human, right? I've never seen underneath someone's clothes before. So there's just so much curiosity there that is not sinful in it of itself.
Yes. Okay, number 4, Bethany.
All right. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of similar to number 3, but you have to tell them that what they're feeling in their bodies when they see porn, you have to help them understand what they're feeling, right? So some combination of fear, intrigue, curiosity, but especially arousal. And I think it's so important to really go slow in these conversations, whether it's preparing them to engage porn or see porn for the first time, often by accident, right? Not something of their choosing. Or if they've already seen it and they're coming to you to talk about it, it's so important to go slow and help them understand the big feelings that are happening in their bodies.
Yeah. And then this is number 5, just to take it a step further, and we will unpack this and we will go slow, but you have to bless their arousal. By bless, I mean to call it good. Even arousal at pornography. God, that's not blessing pornography. That is saying to your children, your son or your daughter, when you see these images, one of the things that's going to happen in your body is that you're going to feel excitement and you're going to feel what's called arousal. And then maybe put some words to what that's like for what that might be like for them. But you have to give language, not just language to arousal, but you have to say, look, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. God made your body to be aroused by goodness. And we are aroused. Let's just talk about arousal for a minute. Arousal is broader than sexuality, but it includes it. We are aroused by care. We are aroused by attunement. When somebody is really paying attention to us, that's arousing. By arousing, I mean chemicals in your body that make you feel good are released. Like oxytocin, like dopamine, there's a variety of them. Arousal is a biochemical experience in your body, and it happens with sexual imagery and sexual experiences. And it also happens with non-sexual experiences that are intimate, that are caring, that are good. And you have to bless that experience of arousal is going to happen in your children around their sexuality as it develops, and around the viewing of pornographic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, arousal is such a huge part of sex. In fact, sex is not pleasurable unless you are aroused. Arousal is this experience of being drawn in, pulled in for something good, something that will offer you pleasure and life. And so we have to first of all bless the fact that our children's bodies are made for that experience,
Right.
and then give them a better definition or a better picture, a better vision for how that ought to be, right? That pornography awakens that in their body, but pornography leads to heartache, right? It leads to death. So giving them a clearer vision, your body is not what's broken. Your body is responding correctly, and it's meant for this beautiful communion with someone you trust that honors your body. And that's where it can be fully lived out, and that's a good thing.
And so when you've talked with other parents about sex ed, you've told me that they often have a hard time with this 5th item of blessing arousal, of calling arousal good. What's it been like for you to talk to parents about that?
Yeah, they are bewildered. They are shocked and bewildered as to why I might be talking about my kids about desire and arousal. But really what I'm talking to them about is the longing to be liked or to be chosen and to be held and to be seen and to be honored. To deny that arousal exists, it just leaves kids wondering what's wrong with them. I have this big feeling, and what am I supposed to do with it? Maybe I'm the only one that feels this in the whole entire world. So parents are just shocked and confused as to why I might talk about arousal and desire with my kids. But the truth is that blessing your child's arousal will actually keep shame from taking root in their hearts.
Say that again. Say that again.
Yeah. Yeah. When you bless your child's arousal, it can help keep shame from taking root in their hearts forever, like for years in the future.
Yes.
It's such a gift we can give to our children to bless their arousal and name that it is good and right. So I longed for my mom to talk to me about these things. Like the fact that I had butterflies in my stomach when this boy asked me to dance at the dance, and then for her to explain to me why I felt so disgusted when he slobbered all over me later that night, right? This entire experience for me at the dance was about arousal, and I had no language for it. And that was the only conversation we ever had about sex.
The byproduct of your mother's sentence of, kissing leads straight to sex is bad. And therefore, what would have happened in your young heart is therefore my arousal is bad.
Yeah.
Like wanting to look pretty even, or
Yes.
wanting to dance with this particular boy even, like that was bad. And that's
Yes.
what got me in trouble. And that's what got me marked by his slobber. And now now evil has a huge foothold in your heart that that something good, namely your sexual desire and arousal, is actually bad and actually dangerous.
Right. Yes. That's what caused the harm. That's what brought it on. Yeah. And I mean, I think I said I became really secretive after that conversation with my mom, but I also became really small, particularly around boys. I already struggled with that from before, earlier abuse stories, but just became even more inward and hidden. Didn't want anyone to take notice of me because I might do something terrible with my body. I might end up accidentally having sex.
Right. Yeah. And when arousal's not blessed, we can say it this simply: all hell will break loose in a teenage body, because teenage bodies are filled with arousal. Not that adult bodies aren't. We're talking about kids right now. So if a teenager, if a 15-year-old feels like their arousal is bad, that's going to lead to shame. What we know about shame is that shame leads to acting out behaviors so that you can confirm the shame and then feel more shameful. It's a horrific, dark, evil cycle, but it can be short-circuited with the simple act of blessing, calling arousal good, letting your children know that those feelings in their body are godly, that they're good, that they're not shameful, and they're not to be feared. Okay, here's the bottom line that we really want to emphasize. You can't do all the things we're talking about if you have not engaged your own sexual story and your own sexual shame. Even if you're the most well-intended parent and you want your kids to have a healthy view of sexuality and you want to parent them well in this area, and even if you read all the right books, you decide you're going to tell them the 5 things that we've just mentioned, you can say it all perfectly. But if you have not engaged your own sexual story and your own sexual shame, and we all have sexual shame, then that shame is going to be transferred in the discussion. It can't not. It's inevitable. Your children will pick up on what you truly feel about sex because they have a right hemisphere in their brain, and their right hemisphere is attuned to your right hemisphere. So you can't hide your sexual shame from your children. You can't. Remember, nonverbal communication, it's far more powerful than verbal communication. The right hemisphere of your kids' brains receives the subtle nonverbal messages of your right hemisphere, and that includes your true feelings about sex and sexuality. So, just to, underscore this and highlight it and put it in bold, the single most important thing you can do when it comes to talking to your kids about sex is to engage your own sexual story and your own sexual shame. Bethany, thoughts on that monologue?
Yeah, I just have so much compassion for people who have really painful, harmful stories around their sexuality. And so I just hope that this podcast episode, these episodes will encourage parents to engage their own stories for their own good as well. It will be a gift to their children, but it will also be a gift to parents personally, and that they might find freedom and healing, and that freedom and healing will trickle down into the relationships and conversations with their kids. Because your children, they want, like you said, Adam, with your dad, you longed to talk to him about anything. And so you would have been happy to sit for hours and talk about sex. We long to have our parents' faces turned towards us and to delight in us. And so when we see disapproval or disgust or fear on their faces around such an important topic, it just terrifies children. Engaging your stories around sexual harm is going to be a gift to you personally, and then it will be a gift to your children.
Yes, that's really well said, Bethany. Thank you. We want you to engage your own story, not just for your children, but for you. For you. Now, a bit of a transition. If you're wondering, all right, it's clear that your own sexual story, your own sexual shame matters. Okay, how are you supposed to know kind of where you are in the process of having a healthy, what we could say is a healthy sexuality? And I would say three things, at least three things, just to put some language to this. Three indicators of healthy sexuality. Number one, if you're married, what role does sexuality play in your marriage? Do you have a healthy sex life? If you're unmarried, what is your sexuality like? What's your relationship to your sexuality, even if you're not married? Unmarried people have a sex life. Okay. It's called masturbation. What's your posture toward that? What's your relationship with that? So, healthy sexuality involves mutual consent, it involves the expression of desire, which can terrify many of us. It involves play, learning your partner, giving and receiving pleasure. And then this one, these are your words, Bethany, that I'm reading right now. So I'll let you comment on them. But the last thing you point out is resilience when there are hiccups, and you put in parentheses, and there always are. Do you want to say more about that, Bethany?
Yeah. I think resiliency in your sexuality, in your sexual relationships is so important. And clearly that requires trust and vulnerability, right? To have something awkward happen and be able to name it and get over that and keep playing, keep being with one another, because it's the act of being together and learning one another and discovering one another that makes sexuality with your spouse or your partner so much fun. So yeah, definitely. Resiliency is a very important part of having a healthy sexuality.
So that's number one of the three. Number two, Bethany, you want to share number two?
Yeah, I think we spent some time talking about arousal, but do you know your own arousal structures? Are you even aware of what turns you on? And can you communicate that with your partner? What turns you off? What are the moments that might trigger old stories of harm that freeze you in the moment and keep you from enjoying sexuality? So, yeah, you need to know your arousal structures.
Yeah, and if I could add, some of you may have immense shame about what turns you on. And all I would say to that is I would plead with you, there is a reason that you are turned on by what you're turned on by. And that reason is found in your story. It's not random. Okay. Fetishes aren't random. They're rooted in narrative. How do I know that? Because I know something about how the brain works. That's just how the brain works. The brain is a memory organ, and story is memory. So you need to not only know your arousal structures, but have you worked through whatever shame you might have about what turns you on? And and if you haven't, the place to look is your story. And I'll mention it now. We'll mention it at the end, but there is a great book written by Jay Stringer called Unwanted that takes you through engaging your sexual story, and that helps you link your current sexuality with your past story, particularly with regard to what arouses you. So that's number 2. Okay, number 3, go ahead, Bethany. What's number 3?
Yeah. Do you have open communication with your spouse or partner about sex, during sex, after sex, before sex? Do you have, the safety and the trust, the foundation laid to be able to have open communication about sex, right? Do you feel comfortable talking to your partner about what turns you on? Most of us have some level of shame about what turns us on, and even maybe about what turns us off, what's difficult for us. Yeah, I think healthy sexuality includes the ability to talk about those things.
For those of you out there that are so committed to being a good parent to your children, like some parents are more committed to being a good parent to their children than they are to being a good spouse. And boy, you cannot succeed at that game, because what your children need most is for you to have a healthy marriage. And we can't stress that enough. If you can't talk openly with your spouse about your sexual desires and your sexual frustrations, that is going to profoundly affect how you talk to your children about sex. So I don't want you to think that you can kind of parent your children well in this area if you're not engaging sexuality in your marriage. You can't do that. You can't do that. Now, I know there's 1,000 different situations, divorce, or you're separated, or you're in an abusive relationship. I can't speak to every single one of these issues, but generally speaking, you have to engage your own sexual relationship in order to parent your children well in this area. Would you agree with that, Bethany, or would you add anything?
I think when you have issues in your marriage, particularly around sexuality, there's disappointment or pain or shame.
And all of us do. And all of us have issues with sexuality in our marriage. There's nobody that doesn't. Okay, let's just say that.
Right. I do. Yeah.
I do.
Yes, I totally do. And I mean, yeah, my husband and I have spent hours arguing and talking about sex. We've been married almost 16 years. So yeah, there's plenty of that. And when you're not engaging it and there isn't a place to grieve together and heal together and grow together, those frustrations and painful places are going to spill out. Right. And so you're not going to be able to be fully present to your children in many places, not just around the topic of sexuality.
Yeah. Let's talk about some more specific kind of everyday things that happen, Bethany, that can be indicators to people about where they are with regard to this. And you bulleted it out some. So go ahead and say these.
There are those moments when you're in the car together and, an explicit song comes on the radio, right? I mean, how quickly do you break into a sweat and reach for the radio to turn it off as fast as you can, but you can't because your fingers are fumbling and you're just nervous. And right. I mean, your kids see that, they notice that. Or when a sex scene comes on TV, or Super Bowl commercials, right? With women with barely any clothes on. What about walking past Victoria's Secret in the mall? How do you engage that moment with your kids?
Yes.
So your kids are watching you. They're watching to see what you do with those songs and commercials, right? And the advertisements. They are watching you to see what your reaction is. What will you do with this, Mom? How can you handle this, Dad? And will you engage it? Will you give language to what we're experiencing together?
Yeah. And, I'll just quote Dan Allender. I think Dan has said this in some way, shape, or form. Forgive me, Dan, if this is not your words, but I'll say it. Sexuality is pulsing in every home. Sex and sexuality is in the air in your home. It can't not be. Like Bethany just said, you walk past Victoria's Secret at the mall, sexuality is, if everyone looks at it, assuming people see the store and they see the models in the windows wearing the lingerie, all of a sudden sex and sexuality is very present in the intersubjective field between you and your children. That matters. That affects them. What comes out of you, and I don't mean out of your mouth necessarily, I just mean what they observe about your comfort or discomfort or general posture towards Victoria's Secrets, that gets communicated to them. And that just needs to be owned. We just need to all own that. There's no way to escape sex and sexuality. And it shouldn't be escaped. But if you're trying to escape it, all I can say is that actually makes sex a bigger thing in your home than if you were talking openly about it. All right, another crucial point that we haven't really said explicitly, but let's just say it. When we talk about the sex talk, we're not talking about one conversation.
Right.
Okay. I mean, think about this. Think about how complex and fraught your sexuality has been for you. All right. How in the world is one conversation sufficient to hold, contain, and navigate all of that complexity? It's one conversation is not enough for a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old. This has to be a series of conversations. Bethany, when should parents start talking to their kids about sex? I know someone's going to want to know the answer to that. Like, when do you start?
My personal opinion is it can start way younger than you all might think. I think, and I began this with my toddlers, but when you're bathing your 2 or 3-year-old, you can ask permission to help them clean their penis or their vulva, right? Using correct terminology. So you're teaching them about their body parts, just like they're learning about what a knee is and what an elbow is. All the parts are added in there into the conversation. And this also teaches them the concept of consent. So it's time to clean your penis now. Do you mind if I use the washcloth gently? Right? And so you just speak to them about it. Consent can also be taught at age 1 or 2 when they start screaming, no, right? Or I do it. That's such a typical phase in development. When they scream that, you can allow their no to carry weight every once in a while. And this teaches them that their voice matters. So you're not having a direct conversation with your 2-year-old about sex, but you are teaching them something of consent, the concept of consent, right? You're teaching them that their voice holds weight in the world. When your child makes a new friend, you can explore how that friendship makes them feel, right? Do you feel chosen and special? What does that feel like in your body? When you got invited to the birthday party, right? It gives them an understanding of what it feels like in their body and how the connection gives them the desire for more, right? I want more invitations. That felt so good. You can then educate them on how the body was made for connection. My kids loved learning about the hormone oxytocin. It's an incredible hormone. I'm a birth doula, so I love teaching about oxytocin in regards to birth, and they just think it's fascinating. And even for them to learn that after an argument between their siblings, if there's an argument and then there's repair, oxytocin is released in the brain, right? So this is such an incredible connecting hormone that is obviously comes up during sex, but in lots of other places in life too. I think life offers so many opportunities to explore these concepts without it having to be a sit down, one time, intense sex talk where everyone feels overwhelmed and awkward.
Before we end, we want to give you some possible next steps for addressing your own sexual story and your own sexual shame, because I hope we've said it loudly enough, but that is the place to start. And there's no way to have good conversations with your children about sex and sexuality until you are in the process of engaging your own sexual story. So, some next steps. You can go back and listen to 3 podcast episodes that I did with Jay Stringer on this topic. It's episodes 49, 50, and 83. I've already mentioned it, but the second thing is you can read Jay Stringer's book that's titled Unwanted. And the subtitle is How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. Third thing, you can go to therapy and tell the therapist you want to engage your sexual story and your sexual shame. That's a lovely, lovely endeavor. What a holy endeavor that is. And then fourth, Bethany, you want to tell about the fourth thing, the Allender Center stuff?
Yeah, Adam and I just would love to invite you to engage in a story workshop at the Allender Center. They're offered once in the fall and once in the spring. And that's a great space, a really safe space for you to bring a particular story around sexual harm, where it'll be engaged by facilitators who are trained in the Allender theory, and with a group who will listen with curiosity and kindness. You can also apply to join the narrative focused trauma care program with the Allender Center. So those are 2 places, at least with the Allender Center, that you can engage your stories around sexual harm.
Yeah. And so the point is, there are places to go. There are things to do. You don't have to do this alone. You can't do it alone. You can't do this work alone of engaging your sexual story and your sexual shame. And there are places to go for help with it. So, that was a whirlwind. Bethany, thank you so much for you're the reason these episodes exist. It was your idea. So thank you for suggesting it, and thank you for all of the work you did on outlining it and putting it together and speaking with me about it today.
Sure, of course. I hope it's really helpful for those who are listening and for the children of those who are listening, and may it bring so much healing and freedom to families.